Director of Pushkin House, which is an independent arts, cultural and social space that explores, challenges and debates Russian cultures and identities today. It gives me a great pleasure to launch our new season tonight with this very special event by the GB Russia Society. So apart from navigating geopolitical crisis, fighting to keep the name of the institution, always looking for supporters who will help us maintain our mission, my job also implies making introductions. And some of them I look forward to more than others. And in this particular case, I'm truly delighted to introduce to you the chair of the GB Russia Society, the organization whose history is so closely intertwined with Pushkin House. Also a trustee of Pushkin Club, which is another organization which is part of Pushkin House DNA. And a former trustee of Pushkin House itself at the most pivotal and crucial times for us as the organization, when we moved from our old building and decided to become a public-facing institution. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Bramell.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Yelena, for that very kind introduction. As chairman of the Great Britain Russia Society, may I wish you all a warm welcome to this evening's talk. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Yelena, for that kind, very kind introduction. As chairman of the Great Britain Russia Society, may I wish you all a warm welcome to this evening's talk, to Pushkin House and to the Society. It's great to see so many of you, both here in Pushkin House as well as online. This is no doubt a reflection both of the seriousness and importance of the subject we'll be discussing this evening, and of the stature and high reputation of our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Sergei Guriev. May I first express our thanks to Pushkin House and to its director, Yelena Sudakova, for having agreed for the second year running to host this evening's special event for the Great Britain Russia Society. This is very greatly appreciated, Yelena. Indeed, we welcome the fruitful partnership that has developed over the last couple of years between the Great Britain Russia Society and Pushkin House, to the mutual benefit, I believe, of both organizations. May I also pay tribute to Yelena and her colleagues for having created in Pushkin House a vibrant and independent cultural space where different perspectives and views on the Russian and post-Soviet worlds can be freely explored and discussed. I'm delighted, I should say, that the honorary president of our society, Professor Jeffrey Hosking, is able to be with us this evening. Our society's patron, His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent, very much regrets that he is unable to be with us this evening, as he had originally hoped, but sends his very best wishes to the Society and to everyone at Pushkin House. We are deeply honored that Professor Sergei Guriev has agreed to deliver the Society's 5th Daniel Salbstein Memorial Lecture. And we are grateful to Sergei for having agreed that we may record his talk. Before I introduce Sergei more fully, I would like to say a few words for the benefit of those who aren't members about the Great Britain Russia Society and its founder, Daniel Salbstein. Now, our original predecessor organization, the Great Britain USSR Association, was established by the British government at the height of the Cold War in 1959 and was sponsored by the Foreign Office. The sister society of our predecessor organization was its Soviet counterpart in Moscow, the USSR Great Britain Society. I think it's wonderful that Pushkin House are now holding an exhibition, Frames of Influence, the centerpiece of which is a selection of photographs sent to Pushkin House in the early 1960s, effectively by our then sister society in Moscow. This exhibition is rightly described as, quotes, shedding light on an important period of cultural diplomacy between the UK and the USSR. And it's certainly worth a visit if you haven't been. It's running until this Saturday, I believe. Now, in contrast to our predecessor organization, but like Pushkin House, the Great Britain-Russia Society is an independent, non-political, non-governmental charity. We receive no funding from the British government, or indeed from any other government, and the society is run and funded entirely by its members. The aim of our society is to promote a wider and deeper appreciation and understanding of Russia and its near neighbors, and of all aspects of the culture, history, and politics of both Russia and its near neighbors. By Russia's near neighbors, we mean all the other countries which, along with Russia, were formerly part of the Soviet Union. We currently have about 200 members. We set out to achieve our objectives in two ways. First, through a program of around 15 to 20 lectures each year from leading experts on political, social, economic, historical, and cultural subjects. And secondly, by way of the Society's high-quality illustrated journal, East-West Review, which is available digitally and in print form to our members. We invite a wide range of speakers from the UK and overseas. Speakers in recent years include Sergei Loznitsa, the brilliant Ukrainian film director, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, Professor Natalia Zubarievich, who spoke to us in Russian by Zoom in March last year from Moscow State University about the then state of the Russian economy. And Dame Deborah Bronnett, the UK's ambassador in Moscow from 2020 to 2023, who gave last year's inspirational Salbstein Memorial Lecture on the subject of UK-Russian relations, in which she underlined the vital importance of taking the long view. We welcome as members anyone with an interest in Russia and or its near neighbors. Members are welcome wherever located and naturally irrespective of nationality. If you are at all interested, do look at our website, gbrussia.org. Like Pushkin House, we have condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, we are entirely opposed to any boycotting or cancelling of Russian culture, especially when relations at the intergovernmental level are difficult. We believe that we should keep the doors to Russia open and, wherever possible, maintain contact between our two peoples. The ongoing Frames of Influence exhibition, which I've mentioned, which shows a valuable contact between the then GB USSR Association and its sister society in Moscow in the early 1960s at the height of the Cold War, is an eloquent illustration of this approach. This evening's memorial lecture is an annual event in commemoration of our founder and much admired former chairman and talks organizer, Daniel Salbstein, who sadly died in 2020. In January 2013, Daniel was awarded a richly deserved OBE in the New Year Honours List for services to the promotion of UK-Russia mutual understanding. The Great Britain-Russia society essentially was Daniel's creation. Without his energy, imagination, and enthusiasm, it's unlikely that the society would exist as it is today. So we all owe Daniel a huge debt of gratitude. Now, to turn to this evening's lecture, the global economic landscape and the political economy of Putin's war. As we are all aware, the last year has seen some major shocks to the world economy. The current global geopolitical situation is perhaps fraught with more uncertainty than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And the previous, quotes, world order to which the West had grown accustomed appears to be dissolving before our eyes. In the new era of uncertainty we have entered, the interconnectedness of economic and political factors is more striking than ever. Not least the crucial importance of a strong economy to a country's military capability. Professor Guriev will explain to us how the two issues identified in the title of his lecture, the state of the world economy and the strength or otherwise of Russia's economy, are interconnected. And he will first give us the benefit of his insights into the present complex and shifting global economic landscape and the different ways in which it may evolve in the future. He will then give us his assessment of the present state of the Russian economy, together with his informed view as to how long, in the absence of intervening external factors, the economy will be able to sustain Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine. Sergei Guriev is one of the most celebrated Russian economists of his generation and is a highly respected commentator both on economic issues and on current events in Russia. Since August 2024, he has been Dean of the London Business School, where he is also a professor of economics. Before that, he served at Sciences Po in Paris, Institut d'études politiques, serving as provost from 2022 to 2024, and as professor of economics from 2013 to 2024. From 2016 to 2019, he served as chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And from 2004 to 2013, he was Morgan Stanley Professor of Economics and a rector at the New Economic School in Moscow. He is a co-author with Daniel Salbstein of the prize-winning book, Spin Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. We are indeed privileged that Sergei Guriev has agreed to talk to us this evening. I can think of no one better qualified than Sergei to address us on the themes of this evening's lecture. Sergei will naturally be keen to hear our questions. So as to ensure we have enough time for Q&A, Sergei will speak for about 30 minutes before we open up things for a good 40 to 45 minutes of Q&A and discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a very warm welcome to Professor Sergei Guriev.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. It's a great honor to deliver the Memorial Daniel Salbstein Lecture and join this event of the Great Britain-Russia Society. When I think about the society, I always think about the word great being part of the society, not just Great Britain. So it's not a Great Britain-Russia Society, but it's a Great Britain-Russia Society. And indeed, this history that you just reminded us is an evidence, testimony to how much has been done and how important indeed is in very difficult times to maintain the relationship between people of these two nations going forward. Indeed, as David said, he asked me to talk about both global economic landscape and political economy of today's Russian regime, and these things are of course connected. One of the things I would like to set from the start as an expectation is I will provide some takeaways. I will tell you something we need to watch in today's overall world and today's Russia, but the world is in such complex and uncertain state that making precise predictions is very hard. Indeed, if we talk about global economic landscape, economists who measure economic policy uncertainty and economic uncertainty overall are observing unprecedented level of volatility and uncertainty in the markets and in economic policy per se. It's not just the economy is uncertain, but also we cannot predict economic policy, in particular in the United States. And that has, of course, a chilling effect on the global economy, which eventually results in political upheaval in Western countries and fiscal pressures that limit Western countries' capacity to support Ukraine against the invasion. So let me outline several unprecedented phenomena that shape the situation in the global economy today. So one, of course, is the trade war and the volatile and unpredictable trade policy undertaken first and foremost by US government. So when you think about the tariff levels that we observed, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, they were in the range of average tariff rates being at the level of 1 or 2 percentage points. So on average import going into a Western country, the government would impose on average a tariff of 1 percentage points. These levels went up during first Trump administration to roughly 2 percentage points. Now the tariffs in place are in around 18 or 20 percentage points, and nobody knows whether they will go up further or go down, whether the threats put on the table by President Trump will be actually implemented, or this is the initial negotiating position against versus trading counterparts. Now that creates, this trade war creates uncertainty, but also suppresses exchange and economic growth. Now, I am happy to take questions about what objectives US government is trying to pursue with the trade war. I should tell you that there is no consensus, neither in the mainstream economics profession, nor we hear within the administration itself, but there is a consensus as well that this trade war has already suppressed economic growth in the US by about 1 percentage point. People who are talking about US recession are not necessarily certain that recession is coming, but the forecast for economic growth in the US is downgraded by about 1 percentage point. So roughly US economy, which was supposed to grow this year by 2.5%, will grow by 1.5% of GDP. US GDP is in the range of $30 trillion, so 1 percentage point is about 300 billion. It's not nothing. On top of that, of course, tariffs contribute to inflation. Inflation expectations are higher. This is why you see this disagreement between President Trump and Federal Reserve Board, where President Trump argues that Federal Reserve system should not be as hawkish on inflation, and they have disagreements on who actually should make those decisions. Now, at the moment and until the spring of 2026, the dominating view in the Federal Reserve Board is in line with macroeconomic orthodoxy, and inflation is under control, even though trade war increases inflation in the United States, again, about by 1 percentage point of GDP. Again, there is no expectation in the market that we will see a runaway inflation, but inflation is elevated. Now, the other thing which is very new, in addition to trade war and uncertain economic policy in the US, the other thing is markets' reaction to this policy in terms of respect for the dollar as a global reserve currency. This is the first time in many decades when we see dollar behaving not as a safe haven, but as an emerging market currency. Usually when you have volatility in the stock market, like we saw in April 2025, after the Liberation Day tariffs announced and then retracted, usually during such volatility, and volatility was, as I mentioned, unprecedented, people buy dollar assets, people buy treasury bonds, dollar becomes stronger because dollar is perceived as the safest financial instrument. This is not what we saw. That was actually a run on the dollar. Prices for government bonds went down, interest rates on these government bonds went up. This is what happens when an emerging market has a volatility episode. So we may actually see the beginning of the end of the global domination of dollar as a reserve currency. And this is something that we observed before. This country used to be the financial superpower up to the World War I. And between World War I and World War II, we had what's called Kindleberger gap. So one dominating financial system was losing its dominance, the other one was just rising. This switch takes time, and that creates additional source of uncertainty and volatility when pound is already gone, but dollar is not yet become the global financial reserve currency. Now, we may be observing this with the exception that we don't really know what can replace dollar, and that creates additional uncertainty and also adds anxiety in the financial markets. So the alternatives could be gold, euro, cryptocurrencies, yuan, and each of them has limited capacity to replace dollar for different reasons. Again, if you have questions, I'm happy to talk about this. So in addition to trade war and the volatility in the dollar market and potential loss of the status of global reserve currency, the third important source of uncertainty and volatility is artificial intelligence. So this is something that keeps a lot of people awake at night, and for the right reason. People in London usually remind us that this is the place where industrial revolution started, and indeed industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution, steam engine, has changed the way global economy works. There were other waves of technological progress, electricity, internet, and yet artificial intelligence is something new. It's not just like electricity, it's also a general purpose technology. But this technology is unprecedented because this is a self-reproducing technological progress. Steam engines could not design new steam engines. Industrial robots could not design new industrial robots. But AI models can write code of new AI models. And that's why we see such an acceleration and also uncertainty of how far this technological revolution will go and what the disruption is going to take place. In my sector, for example, our main product are MBA students, and we see last year and this year that their jobs are being taken over by AI at an unprecedented speed. If you're a law school graduate, I would also worry. But there are other things, of course, where AI can interfere. And again, what is interesting is this particular technological revolution is not taking low-skilled or middle-skilled jobs. It's taking jobs of people who run countries, right? Lawyers are the ones who sit in governments, economists as well, MBA students run businesses. And that disruption, again, is new in many ways. AI is also important because AI consumes a lot of energy. And that also means the demand for energy is not going to peak anytime soon. And that, of course, has direct implications for the oil price and the Russian economic situation. On top of that, of course, we have an existential climate and nature crisis, but given other challenges, people have stopped talking about this. Even though this crisis has not disappeared, global warming continues. Every summer is the hottest summer in history, and the fact that we stop talking about this doesn't mean that this crisis is resolved. So these are at least four major challenges for the global economy. and the sustainability crisis, climate and nature crisis will also have an economic toll, not just in the long run, but also in the short run. But overall, what we see, and this is where the connection is, those challenges create political and economic disruption, drive polarization in our societies, and therefore undermine the resolve of the West, which was so impressive in 2022 to support Ukraine against Putin. In addition to resolve, there is also an issue of resources. As I mentioned, this country is facing fiscal challenges. France faces even bigger fiscal challenges. US faces enormous fiscal challenges, but as long as it can maintain the status of dollar as a global reserve currency, it doesn't need to worry about this, but it's just as you know, in this country, budget deficit is about 2 percentage points of GDP. The country is really worried about this. In France, more than 5% of GDP. The country is more relaxed for some reason about this. US has 7% of GDP budget deficit, and yet no strategy to address this deficit. So these fiscal pressures mean that there are political forces which correctly point to cost of living crisis in Western societies and start counting money, saying, look, why should we support Ukraine if we need to support our own population? And this is where economic growth in Western society is so important. Once this growth slows down, that means that resources are less abundant and the political support of Ukraine is decreasing. Now, let me move to the Russian economic situation. With all the challenges in the West and in the global economy, I'm not here to say that Russian economy is doing well. So Vladimir Putin sometimes makes those statements, but recently the discussion about how Russian economy is growing at 4% per year, suddenly, and therefore faster than US or Europe, suddenly this discussion is about, is Russian economy in stagnation or recession? So indeed, Russian economy did grow at 4% per year in 23 and 24. I can tell you that this is an artificial number which doesn't represent the 4% increase in living standards and economic performance. This is an economy at war, and GDP growth in a war economy is different from GDP growth in a peace economy. The fact that you spent several percentage points of GDP on tanks, ammunition, and soldiers doesn't mean that the economy is doing better. It just means you print money, give it to soldiers' families or to ammunition producers, send these soldiers and ammunitions to Ukraine where they are burned. And so that is equivalent, essentially, to printing money and just handing it to the population. In Russia, of course, it's inflationary, and inflation is not a bug, but a feature of this economy. What is important, though, that this, by traditional macroeconomic statistic, is counted as GDP contribution. So soldier services are counted as services to the government, like doctors or teacher services, and ammunition and tanks production is counted as producing value added, even though that adds no value to the Russian economy. So we should take the 4% number with a grain of salt, but this 4% number in any event is already a thing of the past. At this stage, Russian economy is stagnating. The first quarter of 2025 saw negative growth, minus 0.6% of GDP. Second quarter is plus 0.4% of GDP, so economy is balancing around zero. It's not a recession, and yet there is a challenge, and Mr. Putin himself acknowledges this challenge, talking to his ministers, saying that you need to do something about this, we should grow faster. Now, what I just said about the problems of economic statistics in an economy at war also means that the zero growth means that there is a war economy which continues to balance around zero or growing ammunition production, tanks production, drones production, so on, and the civilian economy which actually is in recession. And this, of course, worries everybody. Living standards are falling. I'll give you one statistic, car sales. In 2025, the forecast for annual car sales is in the range of 1.2 million. This is much less than last year, which was about 1.8 million, 2 million in the previous years. And 10 years ago, Russian consumers bought 3 million cars. So there is a major decline in quality of life. And that is a situation which shows both that Russians face much higher prices and therefore cannot afford as many cars as they could buy. Now, I can also talk about why inflation, official inflation numbers, underestimate inflation. There is a growing consensus within Russia that official numbers are not intentionally distorted, but again, in the economy hit by sanctions and import substitution, you actually have quality adjustment, which is very hard to make, and Russians are paying higher prices for lower quality goods, and this lower quality, if accounted correctly, would show that prices are actually growing faster than official inflation statistics. But nobody doubts that inflation is a real issue, and the Russian central bank keeps a policy rate at a high level. Used to be 21, now it's 17, but 17 is still a huge number for the economy if inflation were not a problem. So this is an economic challenge, but economic challenges are not the only ones that Putin faces. He also faces fiscal challenges because of oil price being at a reasonably low level and oil sanctions. Putin's oil and gas revenues for Putin's budget are 20% year-on-year lower than in 2024. That creates a fiscal deficit, which is at 2% of GDP, 2% of annual GDP for the first 8 months of the year. So if you extrapolate it to the end of the year, it will be closer to 3% of GDP. And so that, as I said, for a country like France or US would not be a big problem. The difference is, of course, that Russia is cut off international financial markets, cannot borrow externally. And that is a pressing issue, especially given that the liquid part of the sovereign wealth fund is at the level of 2% of GDP. So if you just start spending sovereign wealth fund today, in a few months, you will run out of money. But of course, Vladimir Putin doesn't want to do it, so he's now talking about increasing taxes next year. He's also pushing Russian banks to buy Russian government bonds. The state banks in Russia control about 80% of Russian banking assets. So Russian banking system, even though it includes about 300 private banks, is essentially concentrated in the state hands. And there is an opportunity there. And again, nobody knows how far it can go, because if Russian banks' balance sheet is not stable, that may trigger a bank run. So there is an issue. The other issue which is important is, of course, a political issue, that support for the war is going down. So poll after poll shows that majority of Russians would prefer peace negotiations to continue in the war. So the most recent September Levada poll shows that 66% of Russians would prefer starting negotiations. About 10% decline to respond, and about 30% support continue the military action. Now, remember that people who respond to polls in today's Russia say that they support the war. So in all these polls where people say we want the peace, they also say special military operation is proceeding successfully, and it was a good idea to start it. So there is yet another layer of people who are not part of those polls who probably also support ending this war. So how does Mr. Putin respond to this challenge of social and political discontent? Of course, he invests in internal repression. So one of the things which we see when we talk about Russian economic and political situation today, people usually project their memories of Russia from 2012 or from 2019, and that's a very different country in terms of level of repression. The conversation we are having today would land the whole room in prison for 10 years if we were in Russia. And indeed, we have a level of political repression similar to that of Soviet Union in terms of number of political prisoners. But actually, in some ways, those prison terms are longer than in late Soviet Union. It's still not Stalin's level of repression, of course, but it is a very repressive state when speaking out and actually protesting is very costly. And of course, it also adds to the fiscal pressure because you need to pay all these policemen and KGB officers. Now, Putin is playing, therefore, on several fronts. He needs to invest in international relations and try to circumvent sanctions to get a modern technology, to build drones in particular. So he runs a hybrid war against the West, trying to threaten political supporters of Ukraine. So he, as I said, is trying to think about fiscal challenges and raising taxes, but he still continues the war. So he is in a difficult situation, and this is where I would deliver you one most important takeaway. Which one single variable we need to watch to understand whether Mr. Putin is going to start negotiating soon. And this simple sufficient statistic, as we call in academia, one single signal, one single variable you need to watch is his advancement on the battlefield. As long as he's moving forward on the battlefield, he has no interest to negotiate. If he is advancing on the battlefield, it means he has enough financial, military, human resources to continue this war. Even though a majority of Russians don't want to continue this war, even though Russian demographics is in a crisis, you know that Russian Statistics Agency stopped publishing demographic data, even though the fact that he's underinvesting in healthcare, education, infrastructure, and technological advances other than military technology means that he's robbing Russian future. That doesn't stop him because he can mobilize those resources and can continue this war. And I think this is where we need to remember that if you want to know when Mr. Putin's war is close to the end, you need to watch the battlefield. However slow his progress is on the battlefield, it makes his future negotiating position stronger. And in that respect, when we see that he is progressing, we should conclude that his difficult game on several chessboards is interpreted by him himself as successful. And vice versa, when the conflict is frozen on the battlefield, that means that he's facing those challenges but not getting anything tangible from continuing this war. Now, where does that leave us in terms of policy implications? To stop this war, to save Ukrainian lives and Russian lives, we need to make sure that this progress is stopped, which means tighter sanctions, which means support for Ukraine in military terms, be it new technology, be it ammunition, be it peacekeeping forces, threatening action against Mr. Putin. Poland now started to talk about supporting Ukraine with military jets, so closing the Ukrainian sky for Russian jet fighters. So all of that is very important because Ukraine is also in a difficult situation, fiscally, economically, and demographically. And in terms of sanctions, oil sanctions need to be tightened, technological sanctions need to be tightened. Mr. Putin will, of course, try to circumvent those sanctions, but each new loophole is more expensive and therefore adds to the fiscal pressure. And in that sense, whenever the US and Europe can increase the pressure on countries that help Mr. Putin to circumvent technological sanctions, that saves lives. Secondary sanctions can also help, where US and Europe can actually make sure that countries that help Putin are afraid of being sanctioned themselves. Europe has made a lot of progress on this particular instrument. Before this war, Europe did not like secondary sanctions at all. Now it is finally rolling out secondary sanctions instrument in practical terms. So we do see a lot of progress. Some of that, unfortunately, is too little too late, but we should not despair in the sense that Mr. Putin is not in an enviable position. And if we manage to stop his progress on the battlefield, those political and economic and social forces will eventually force him to negotiate. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei. That's absolutely brilliant. You've given us a lot to think about. I can already see several hands in the audience. Lauren Gerlach, would you like to put your question?
Thank you. Yeah, great chat. You talked a lot about how unaffordable war is. It seems to me peace would also be unaffordable. The economy is totally geared for warfare. It would fall into deep recession. You've got over 1 million men on the front who are being paid 5 times the average wage to be there, with bonuses for everyone they kill, for every injury they suffer. They would come home to severe recession. Nobody gives a damn about them. They think you made your money. Why should we care about you? Russians have been shown to be completely uncaring about death and wounds on the front. So you would have these people who know how to kill, and that's all they know, and a lot of them are convicts as well, coming back to economic devastation and severe recession. I don't think Putin can afford to stop war. If he gets stymied in Ukraine, he needs war somewhere else. His whole society depends on it now.
Thank you. There is, of course, a dimension that he also needs an enemy to justify internal repression, right? He also needs the war to justify tightening the belts, so in terms of a narrative. But eventually, financial challenges are objective. So if you run low on cash, the only thing you can do is indeed increase taxes, which in itself triggers a doom loop. You increase taxes, economy is suffering even more, you have even less happier people. So all of that is real. What you mentioned is also an important issue, and everybody remembers the situation in the 1990s when Soviet Union stopped funding the Soviet war machine, and that triggered a major recession in Soviet Union and in Russia in particular. I should say that that was a very different situation in the following sense. The military-industrial complex, as they called it in Soviet Union, was much bigger as a share of the economy than today's Russia military machine. So some people would say it was 15% of GDP, some would say it was 20% of GDP. Today's official Russian military budget is like 7% of GDP. You can add various other sectors contributing to the war machine, but then in Soviet Union that was also the case, where a lot of research, for example, was done for the military operation. Most of the steel was produced for the military-industrial complex. So in that sense, that shock was bigger than the shock that would be if Putin stops the war. Now, if Putin stops the war, he will not become an angel of peace, and he will continue accumulating weapons. He will try to replenish the stocks. So the defense industry will be continuing to be busy. The 1 million people coming back from the front to peace life or whatever it is, I fully agree with you, it's going to be a major social and political challenge. Now, we do have the rotation of these people anyway, right? So these people are coming back from the front, and we do see the challenges. It's just staggered over cohorts of soldiers coming back home. So in that sense, it's not a problem which will be a new problem, and probably he will demobilize them in waves as well. So in the end of the day, if you compare the situation with the peace versus the situation of the war, the situation with the war is more expensive because you do lose people every month. You need to pay money to their families. So you need to produce more weapons than you would produce in the situation with replenishing the stocks. And yes, you can have a recession, but at least you save fiscal resources. Right now, as I said, he is facing a day of reckoning where his sovereign wealth fund, which used to be at the level of 10% of GDP, is now 2% of GDP and running lower and lower by the months. And raising taxes is very unpopular, as you can imagine. And most of all, as I said, majority of Russian population is tired of this war. So the war is costlier than the peace. The peace will be costly, but in relative terms, you can go item by item, and you can see how peace is still, in relative terms, will be less costly.
Philip, would you like to put your question?
Yes, sorry. My name is Philip Corsano. I'm a former MBA student Yeah, so you mentioned the 1990s and when the Russian economy was going through an incredible disruption and GDP collapsed. One of the things that I hoped to understand was, given the incredible concentration of the Russian economy, the sort of oligarchical structure, how is it possible that this economy can survive all these disruptions? And at some point, the hope I'd always hoped was that the actual oligarchs, which were the ones that had benefited from the 1990s, would see that the writing's on the wall, and this is an economy which perhaps cannot sustain a transition to anything forward-looking, whether it's peace, whether it's continuation of the war.
Thank you, Philip. Indeed, large businesses or small businesses, with the exception of sectors which work directly for the war machine, and indeed are at the capacity utilization of 100% 24/7, the civilian economy is very unhappy. And if you look at the interviews of oligarchs, they hint that they would prefer a different course of action. But this is also the level of repression where if you speak out against the war, it's not just a threat against your business, it's also a physical risk. People fall out of the windows. People are getting very clear messages that speaking against the war is a dangerous course. So this unhappiness, this discontent, it's not just among the people in Russia, but also among the elites. They're very worried about this. So this is a different game relative to what it used to be just 10 years ago or 20 years ago. This is a very brutal regime, not only towards Ukrainians, but also towards Russians, including the very rich Russians. Now, talking about the sources of resilience of this economy, this war is still a reasonably minor war for Russia. We talked about the army. The invasion army was in the range of 200,000. Probably today, the whole military force supporting the combat units and combat units themselves is probably indeed in the range of 1 million. Another 1 million probably left the country. 1 million is probably killed or wounded. But interestingly, for a country as big as Russia, however brutally that sounds, it's still a relatively small number of the population. As I said, military spending went up from something like 3.5% to 7% of GDP. It's a lot of money, but it's 7% of GDP, not 20 and not 30, like it is in Ukraine, for example, right? So for Ukraine, it's a huge war. For Russia, it's still, however cynically that sounds, is an affordable war. And indeed, Russians are suffering lower living standards, but nobody would give you an estimate that living standards went down by more than 10%. And again, 10% in a country like this would mean Prime Minister is out of the office. But if you, in addition to ballot box, you have special right police and the KGB, people have no way to protest and stop this course of action, neither elites nor the ordinary people. So economy is not doing well, but it's a war this economy can afford. So, and whenever we say that the whole economy is working for the war, it is not true. It is a limited number of people, limited number of sectors, which contributes to this operation. And the vast majority of Russians work for civilian economy, and vast majority of firms actually don't contribute to the war.
Thank you, sir. A lot of people have put their hands up. I will get to you all, but could I first invite the lady in the front row? Could you give me your name?
1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
Thank you. Bhavna Dave. I teach at SOAS Politics, work on Central Asia. You have written on spin dictators and informational autocrats. So hypothetically, if Putin wanted to end the war, and how, I want to know how will he spin whatever advances he has made to convince the people? Because here, it's true that people are tired of the war, people in major cities, but also from what I hear, I haven't been to Russia in 4 years, that when people go in Moscow, St. Petersburg, the theaters are full, the concert halls are full, the restaurants are doing very well. So it seems to me that as long as the people who are living in these cities are not so badly off, I mean, they have different, the people who from the provinces and others who have been fighting in the war and who have been promised all this, they may be abandoned. So even if there's a lot of grievances and disaffection among them, they are not likely, it's not cumulatively going to affect. So I think something needs to be very drastically shift in the life standards and services that people in the cities enjoy. So that's one thing. And secondly, I was just wondering if, I mean, just maybe connected to this, you may or may not have time to answer. To what extent North Korea's support and now supply of army and also the migrants who are working, how likely is that going to sustain the war and at least, and thirdly, I don't know if India stops, or I mean not stops, but buys less oil from Russia and strikes a deal with Trump, again, how much these things are likely to have an effect.
Right, you asked about 5 questions. So let me go one by one. So first question, the spin for ending the war will be very easy. Putin will say, yes, we have to stop it here. We didn't get this or this big city, but we've defended substantial part of East Ukraine from Western Nazis or whatever he calls them. So he will say, we fought against the whole West, and yet we gained territories. So this is a show of strength, and then he freezes the conflict. He keeps counting Kherson and Zaporizhzhia as Russian cities, but that never stopped Putin from Putin's narratives are often inconsistent. It never stopped Putin from pushing inconsistent narratives. But his argument will be, we freeze the war, we won it, it's fine. And again, since he completely controls domestic debate, people who will start arguing with him will be punished somehow. Which brings me into the Moscow-St. Petersburg story. So apparently there are many unhappy people there, but we don't know. Once again, if you've not been to Russia for a while, you still have those memories where people would be freely speaking about their discontent. This is physically dangerous today, right? And so the fact that people go to theaters doesn't mean that they love the war. And Putin's job is to make sure that it looks like that Moscow and St. Petersburg are happy, so people who are unhappy don't know how many unhappy people are around. Putin's job is also to make sure that Western viewers think about life is going on, business as usual, everybody's happy. So this is part of the spin, if you like, to maintain this illusion that everybody supports the war and life continues as normal. There is nothing normal about this economy, as I said. It's not doing well, prices are higher, consumption is lower, so all of that is important. It's just Putin's job is to make sure that outside audiences believe, or internal audiences as well, believe that things are fine. So this is his objective. Now, as you rightly said, he also wants to make sure that in relative terms, Moscow feels better because revolutions take place in capitals. So for him, redistributing towards Muscovites is also useful. And finally, a question about India. So the initial oil sanction policy was what's called oil price cap. It's still formally in place. And the idea of this policy is India can buy Russian oil, but should not buy it at the market price. It should buy it at a lower price. So the oil rent that otherwise would be received by Putin would actually go to India. And that was not a bug, it was a feature of this policy that India actually buys at lower price, refines, and sells oil products at the market price. So that was the conscious policy of European Union and United States. Now United States administration somehow made a 180-degree change and suggests that India stops buying Russian oil. The rationale of oil price cap policy was that if we take Russian oil from the market, oil prices will actually go through the roof. And that little oil that Putin manages to sell to China will bring him even more money than in the current situation. So there was a conscious choice not to go after the full embargo, allow India and China to continue to buy Russian oil, but make sure that seaborne Russian oil is bought at a lower price so Putin doesn't have as much money. So that was the policy. Why the US government is doing something different and how this will be negotiated with the Indian government, I have no idea. So Indian government says, you told us one thing a year ago, 2 years ago, now you are changing your views. We don't know what to make of this. And this conversation is extremely confusing. So we don't have an answer to this.
Gentleman there, please. Would you give your name?
Thanks, Chairman. My name is Bakhtiar. Sergei Muratovich, I would probably selfishly pivot to a bit of a regional context of what's happening right now with Russian economy. Selfishly because I am indeed from the region. And my question is, what's your view on how the current state of Russian economy benefits, or perhaps on the opposite, doesn't benefit the regional economies? I would say, two big blocks, Central Asia, Southern Caucasus. And in your answer, if you can expand both in the short term and in the long term. I can see both sides. I mean, 80% of my country's key export is going through Russia. I mean, we should not forget I'm from Kazakhstan. And I would just be really curious to see how can it play out for the regional stage. Thank you.
Thank you. I think neighboring countries do benefit in many ways. One is, as you said, serving as trade intermediaries for Russian exports and imports, of course, creates additional jobs and revenues in third countries. And then the other opportunities, of course, that a huge part of Russian emigration ended up in these countries, and people who left, probably better educated younger people who create jobs not just for themselves but also for other people, being entrepreneurial and human capital rich. So in that sense, it's a positive development for those countries, both in the short term and the long term, because many of these people will never come back to Russia.
Thank you. I'm trying to be as fair as possible. The lady in the front row, please. And would you give your name?
Thank you very much. Aniga Jafarova, so I am CIS economist. I have two quick questions. One question, I want to go back to gentleman's question about what if soldiers, convicts come back to an economy which is in a recession. So just wanted to check your opinion about that. Aren't we forgetting one key variable, which is potential sanctions relief if there is a peace deal, which can actually boost the economy and people don't actually come to recession. And the second question, quick question, I know it's difficult to predict, but what do you think about potential confiscation of Russian assets that are frozen in Europe, especially given your comment about dollar using the power? Are there concern in European circle? Thank you.
Thank you. The first question is very important. We don't know what what the deal will be and how many sanctions will be removed. In principle, some of the sanctions should be removed after Putin returns to the territory, right? So if you think about this in a serious way, sanctions were introduced as a punishment for the aggression. If you invade a neighboring country and then remove the sanctions are removed after you freeze the conflict, this is a huge incentive for future perpetrators. The whole idea of sanctions tools is about sending a signal that invading neighbors is costly. And if Putin's behavior is rewarded in the sense that he gains the territory and continues business as usual without any remaining sanctions, that is actually incentivizing future aggressors. So I don't know. I will not speculate what the peace deal will be. I'm just saying that right now Putin is not interested in any peace deal, simply because he's moving forward, and as long as he's moving forward, he believes he's winning, and he's gaining bargaining power in the future negotiation. So on your second question about confiscation of Russian assets, these amounts are huge. Russia says that 300 billion were frozen. Euroclear alone holds about 200 billion, and this is probably the most important conversation which is happening. As you rightly said, European Central Bank says we want to be a global reserve currency. If we weaponize our financial instruments, then we will put at risk the potential of euro. This is the job of ECB to care about financial stability, but politics is not just about euro. And political leaders should think about security of the continent and should remember that if you give this money back to Putin, he will get a lot more money than he was deprived by other sanctions, right? So if you think about this, when we talk about this sovereign wealth fund, 2% of GDP here, 3% of GDP here, 300 billion is 15% of GDP. So with this amount of money, Putin will hire a lot more soldiers and a lot more people will die. So this is as straightforward as this. So giving this money back to Putin means encouraging and supporting aggression and also providing resources for Putin as an aggressor. There are different ways to confiscate those assets. There are some legal pathways. European Parliament actually commissioned a study which showed that it's possible to do it legally. There is also a very cunning way not to confiscate the assets but create what's called a bad bank, so create a special vehicle of Euroclear. And this bank would have one single depositor, Russian government, and one single debtor, Ukrainian government. So this bank would use this money and lend to Ukrainian government and wait for Russian government to pay reparations. When Russian government pays reparation to Ukraine, Ukraine returns this money to the entity. This entity repays Putin's deposits. No reparations, no return of this deposit, right? So there is this column by Martin Sandbu, I think a couple of weeks ago in the Financial Times. It's a very smart suggestion without expropriation, just saying, this is your money, we are just temporarily using it until you pay reparations, right? So this is, there is an ongoing debate, but I think we should remember how Putin uses each additional $1 billion. He recruits soldiers, he builds drones, he kills people, and somebody will have to pay for this, for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And as I said in the beginning, the West doesn't have extra fiscal space. So this money should be used for reconstruction of Ukraine.
Yeah, before I take another question from the floor, could I just put a point to you, which seems to me to make academic all this speculation about sanctions. The EU is at the moment paying more to Russia for the purchase of oil and gas, Romania and Slovakia in particular. And Trump himself has said he's willing to impose secondary sanctions, provided the EU stops buying oil and gas, and provided the EU, he's talked about NATO, but he means the EU, provided they impose 50 to 100% tariff sanctions on China. Well, realistically, no EU country could agree to the latter point. But I've always been puzzled by how it is that the amount of money that the EU is paying to Russia exceeds the value of the military and financial support it's giving to Ukraine. I'm surprised there's not been more of an outcry. It's not an anti-EU point, but it's simply a point of fact. Can you explain that? And is that not going to be a dilemma for any successful economic resolution of the conflict?
Yes, and this country in particular actually stopped buying Russian oil in the spring of 2022, yeah. But it was not an important decision because UK did not depend on Russian oil and gas. A more painful decision was for Germany, which depended critically on Russian gas, oil and coal, and Germany was very slow to make a decision to stop buying Russian oil and gas. Eventually they did it. Economists from the very beginning said, and I was among those economists, we said, you should do it as soon as possible. It will be costly. GDP can stop growing. We were talking about something like from 1 to 3 percentage points of GDP growth lost because of this decision, and that's exactly what happened. German economy is not doing well right now. It's not a disaster. It's not comparable to recession during COVID years. It's a price to pay, but German political class decided to do it eventually, and voters seem to support it at that point. Probably less and less so today, but Germany managed to do it. Hungary and Slovakia can afford to do it, but they just don't want to pay this cost.
Yeah.
Now, your point is very important. Just let's go back to 2022. In the first week of the war, the West froze those assets, central bank's assets, 300 billion. Putin lost 300 billion. In 2022 alone, before oil sanctions were introduced, the West indeed paid Russia a comparable amount. Russian trade surplus in that year was $230 billion. So almost everything the West took from Russia was actually given back in 2022 alone, and then continued to be paid to Russia. That said, I should say that indeed the most important challenge for the West is to make sure that Putin is not getting a market price for his oil. It's not very important whether Slovakia or India is buying Russian oil. What is important is to pay less to Putin, so Putin doesn't have as much financial resource.
Yeah, thank you, Sergei. Roger Cockerell, I think you have a question.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Roger Cockerell. I am very interested in China, and we recently had this grand meeting in China, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the role that China is playing here and the relationship between President Xi and Putin.
Thank you. China plays a very important role. Officially, China doesn't recognize annexation of Ukrainian territory and has never done so and is unlikely to do so in the future for obvious reasons. China continues to be the most important trading partner of Russia. Used to be EU, now it's China. And whatever advanced technology Russia is getting eventually from China. There are also special circumvention mechanisms and instruments where the Western technology also gets to Russia, but China has not joined the sanctioning coalition. China has not imposed sanctions on Russia and continues trading with Russia, buying Russian oil, but also selling Russia technology. And I think it's very, very, very important. China could have done more for Russia. China could have done less for Russia, but at the current level, Russian economy and military machine depends critically on trading with China. So China could have made Putin's life much more difficult. Some people would say that occasionally when Putin talks about nuclear threat, it is Chinese government which tells him it's a bad idea, please stop talking about this. So.
Thank you. The gentleman in the corner, please. Yeah.
I'll just wait for the ambulance to go by. Sergei, thank you very much for the talk. It was very good. Luke Mankel from the OECD. I have a question which is, when we think about the Russian economy and we think about the political economy of Russia, we often use certain heuristics, right? Like there's rentierism, there's crony capitalism, there's like an asymmetrical relationship between the center and the regions. We use these types of concepts to understand the Russian economy and the politics thereof. My question is quite simple. Has the war consolidated the way that we think or should think about those general first principles of the post-Soviet Russian economy or the Putin's Russian economy? Or has it changed them in a meaningful sense? And if it has changed them, from the perspective of policymakers, how should we be thinking about those changes?
Thank you. We just mentioned our book with Dan Trisman about spin dictators. It used to be a very sophisticated spin dictatorship. Now it's a traditional repression-based personalistic dictatorship. Putin pretends to have a party. This is not a real party. He pretends to have an ideology. There is no real ideology. This is what we call in this book a fear dictatorship. Now, this is not just a fear dictatorship built from scratch. It's a fear dictatorship which emerged from spin dictatorship. So there are still some legacies and features inherited from spin dictatorship. So there are still spin doctors in presidential administration who try to say, you still need us, even though Putin doesn't. But they try to keep being employed, and they push narratives. They try to pretend that they need to produce some spin to keep population convinced. But overall, the ultimate mechanism of control now is fear. I talked about oligarchs who fall out of the windows. This is a very tangible instrument of controlling both the elites and the public. So it is a fear dictatorship. It's not the only fear dictatorship that is based on markets and capitalist principles, but it's also true that this is not a rule of law society. Property rights are not protected, and especially now, you see a growing number of expropriations, a growing number of business people going to jail. So it's if you like, it's crony capitalism still, in economic sense, with very high corruption, but also in political sense, it's a repression-based open dictatorship. And there has been evolution, as I said. It's changed.
Yes, a gentleman in the check shirt, please. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Max Hess, analyst. My question to you, if I may too, firstly is Russia's obviously been in sovereign default that it was forced into as a result of the sanctions in 2022, although debt to GDP still remains technically very low. And then there's been a very large buildup of another number of other claims against Russia, arbitration involving Uniper and Gazprom and so on and so forth. To what extent do you see these as an albatross over the neck of Russia in the future, and how difficult a challenge will this be, or is it a relatively minor one? And then secondly, much more broader, what happens if Putin gets hit by a lightning strike tomorrow?
Right. The last question I get a lot, and in this country it's a very easy question to answer. There is a movie, a British comedy called The Death of Stalin, and this is this movie is banned in Russia, right? It's illegal to watch this movie in Russia. So, but that gives you a good forecast what may happen after something happens to Mr. Putin. On the lawsuits and claims, on the debt side, I think the debt, as you rightly said, is so negligible that doesn't really matter. And it's not going to be a big problem. The big problem is reparations. Russia will have to pay reparations. Russia will have to pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. The current estimates by the World Bank are in the range of $500 billion of the cost of reconstruction of Ukraine. The direct damage to infrastructure, buildings, factories is in the range of 200 billion. So somewhere in this range, Russia will have to pay. Part of that will be paid by these sovereign assets, which are frozen. Part of that could be something which was done for Kuwait and Iraq, when for 30 years, Iraq was paying a share of oil revenues to Kuwait. And Russia, after all, is a $2 trillion economy. So $100 billion, $200 billion over 30 years is something that Russia can easily afford to repay.
Sorry, just on that point, Sergei, could I be devil's advocate? We all remember, as I'm sure Steve Witkoff does, the pernicious consequences of the Versailles settlement that was imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War. The whole issue of German reparations was a gift to the burgeoning Nazi party. Would not the imposition of such a huge bill on Russia following a peace settlement of whatever kind, this would cause lasting resentment and perhaps mean that Russia would take much longer to be readmitted to the world of civilized nations, if I can put it that way?
Thank you, David. This is a real concern, and this is why I mentioned that this is affordable. So this is not a huge amount for a $2 trillion economy. If it's spread over many years, if it's based on this pot of money which is already frozen and nobody in Russia is hoping to get it back, I think this is affordable. And the concern you raised is very important and tangible. I fully agree with that. But somebody will have to pay for this. Ukrainians don't have this money. Europeans and Americans increasingly are conscious of their own fiscal constraints. And there is no political appetite to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction if Russia doesn't pay. So it's just physically we don't know where else to get this money.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Jeffrey Hosking, the president of our society.
Thank you, Sergei. Thanks for a very lucid lecture. You said that Russia is cut off from the international payments system, but I believe the Chinese have set up their own international payment system, and presumably Russia can use, in fact, probably is using that payment system. Is that right?
So what I said, Russia is cut off from international financial markets. So it's harder to borrow. The payment system, yes, Russia's cut off from the Western payment system, but indeed can make transactions in yuan, and that is what's happening. What is not happening, though, is Russia successfully borrowing huge amounts from Chinese banks. And there are several reasons for this. One is Chinese banks don't like to support Russia, and Chinese government probably doesn't like to support Russia because the risks of not getting this money back, those risks are substantial. And second, there are threats of financial sanctions. A big Chinese bank cares about not being sanctioned by the United States or Europe. Now, there is, of course, a situation where a small Chinese bank can lend certain amounts to Russian counterparts, but the small Chinese bank doesn't have a balance sheet for a lot of money. And second, if a small Chinese bank is sanctioned by the United States, this bank will be untouchable by the rest of the financial system in China as well. So none of that is easy for Chinese players who care about being part of the global financial system. And in any event, those markets are not very deep. And borrowing in those markets is more expensive. So it's hard for Russia to raise funds outside of the Western system, and it's impossible to raise funds in the Western system.
Yeah, thank you. Henry Pears. Henry, please, in the second row.
Thank you. Yeah, Henry Pears. Thank you very much indeed, Sergei, for your very enlightening talk and answers, more and more answers. In his autobiography, Patriot, Alexei Navalny recounts how 14 years ago you were one of 16 people who provided the initial backing for his anti-corruption foundation. So presumably at that point, you had some kind of view of a better Russia ahead. 14 years later, quite a lot has changed. I wonder if you can give us any idea, practically and realistically, of how Russia may change again in the next 10 or 20 years and be a better neighbor for its neighbors and a better place for its people.
Thank you, Henry. I would like to recognize my wife, Ekaterina Zhuravska, who was the other person among those 16 in 2012. So there were 2 of us among the 16. So I think countries don't disappear. Geography cannot be easily changed. Russia will be a neighbor to Ukraine and Europe, and both Ukraine and Europe will be interested in Russia becoming a peaceful and prosperous country. And so I think there is a path for every country, including Germany. As you mentioned, Germany has become one of the most important members of the European Union, and with all its challenges, it's a vibrant democracy. So if Germany can do it, we have no argument why Russia cannot do it. It may be harder in various respects, but it is a country where a lot of people think about the society as a European society, have a preference for European way of life, and it may happen in the next 20 years, may not, we don't know. But ruling out this future for Russia, I think, is it's very hard to justify. So, as I said, many countries which used to be dictatorships became democracies. Actually, every democracy today used to be a dictatorship. Even this country was not a democracy 1,000 years ago, and maybe even 200 years ago. So there is progress. There are waves of democratizations. Some of these democratizations are reversed. So maybe Russia becomes a democracy and becomes a dictatorship again. We cannot rule that out as well. But I just don't see I just don't see why we can say that Germans deserve democracy and Russians don't. Germans know how to build democracy and Russians don't. I think it's essentially a racist argument.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Martin Macaulay, please.
To come back to China, what percentage of companies in Russia are Chinese? And Xi Jinping doesn't want Putin to lose the war. He's providing war material and everything. But if it comes to a crisis in Russia, do you see China bailing out Russia because it gives China enormous power to negotiate with Russia and invest in Russia and make Russia more dependent on China. But the Chinese economy at present has problems. And as you said, Chinese banks don't like lending to Russian banks. But do you see? Do you see China, if Russia gets into really trouble, bailing Russia out because it's in the interest of China, and China could exact an enormous price for doing that?
Thank you. For all practical purposes, Russia is very dependent on China for the reasons we discussed. Indeed, China's influence on Russian politics and policies is essentially unlimited. China is very smart about making choices in negotiations with Russia. But, for example, what we are now talking about is the new Power of Siberia pipeline, where we see that Mr. Putin wants to celebrate that this agreement was signed, but this is not an agreement, it's a memorandum of understanding. There is no price, volume, it's not clear who pays for it, and China can use Russia's being in the corner for its own interests. So this is, as you said, China does that already, will do more of this. The job of Chinese leadership is pursue the benefit of China, not of Russia. And so they use difficulties that Russia is facing for its own benefit. So this is something that we are going to see. You said that China is not interested in Russia losing this war. That's probably true. We don't know what China's strategy is regarding this war. Some people would say China doesn't want Russia to lose this war, but China also is not interested in brutal wars in other countries around Russia. So it's very hard to figure out what the strategy is exactly, because the peace plans proposed by Chinese government are also not very specific.
Yeah, I think we've time for two more questions. The gentleman in the blue shirt, please.
Thanks very much. Matthew Luxmeyer, cover the war for the Wall Street Journal. Most of the questions I wanted to ask have been asked, but let me ask you this one. You mentioned that a lot of Russians are living more poorly than they did 3.5 years ago. They're buying less cars. Some Russians are living a lot better, right? There's huge payouts going to the families of soldiers who have died in Ukraine. There's people working triple shifts in the local military factory making a lot more money. Do you think there's a scenario? I'd say at this point Putin doesn't have to care particularly about what the ordinary Russians think, right, because of all the reasons that you mentioned. But there's a scenario where there's a lot of societal tension, as we see in some, small towns and villages, and it comes to the point where, I don't know, it becomes a problem for him. Politically.
I think indeed what's happening right now is redistribution towards poorest part of Russia. And I think because of payments to soldiers and their families, actually, by definition, these are recruited in the poorest regions, in the poorest towns. And as you rightly said, many of those families are actually benefiting from this war at a huge cost of their men being killed or wounded. But that is also bringing us to a comment that I would like to make. It's not answering your question, but I would like to make this comment. When people are saying that Putin is giving this money to the poorest parts of Russia, poorest families, he could have done that without the war.
Yeah.
If you think about this, he was sitting on a big war chest. This could also be just an anti-poverty chest without killing Ukrainians and without wounding those men, right? So in that sense, it's something we should always keep in mind, that the fact that this redistribution is happening, it's happening at a huge cost for the for the Ukrainian future, for Russian families today, for Russia's future, and in that sense, it's a very cynical proposition that is made by Putin today. Now, at this stage, I don't see any political tensions arising there. I think that this redistribution is actually benefiting some of the poorest cities and towns. Consumption in those cities and towns is actually going up from very low level, but still. So this redistribution is benefiting the poorest parts of Russian society.
Yeah. A final question. Michael Holman, please.
Thank you very much, Sergei. That was a hugely informative talk. In all our minds, behind everything you've been saying is obviously the fate of Ukraine, and you've mentioned Ukraine not very often. How long can Ukraine hold out psychologically, politically, militarily, and economically, given its size in relation to the huge size of Russia? Russia can wait, Ukraine can't.
So I would rather abstain from discussing this issue because it means going into Ukrainian politics, and somebody born in Russia, I don't feel well about discussing Ukrainian politics. As I said, military spending is a huge part of Ukrainian GDP. We are talking about something like 30% of Ukrainian GDP spent on the war. So far, it's affordable for the West to provide financial resources. Ukraine is getting a limited amount of military support. And of course, human resources are running very low. So Ukraine is worried about its future, but I guess it's a question for another day for Great Britain-Ukraine society.
Sergei, may I thank you on behalf of us all. You've given us a very clear analysis of the Russian economy. You have given us an incredibly lucid overview of the complexity of the current global economic landscape, and you've answered all our questions. I'll use one phrase to describe it, one word: lucidity. And may I say, in these dark and dismal times, I regard you as an unerring voice of clarity, an unfailing voice of light and reason. And so we really are indebted to you, Sergei, and I'd like to thank you for giving us such an enlightening talk, which is absolutely worthy of the Daniel Salbstein Lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Before we leave, may I just announce the next talk by the Great Britain Russia Society, which will be by Zoom 3 weeks today, Thursday, the 9th of October. Anastasia Steinert will be talking to us about the mysterious world of the mysterious literary worlds of Nikolai Gogol. As you know, Gogol lived from 1809 to 1852 and remains one of the most original and innovative of Russian writers. This will be a very interesting talk, and Anastasia will give us an outline of Gogol's biography, his very interesting life, and also we'll be talking about, in particular, his Petersburg Tales. So please do feel free to book at gbrussia.org, and thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Pushkin House for the immaculate arrangements.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Sergei. And you do indeed, you're one of those minds that does provide inspiration and clarity. And on that note, I would also like to invite you to Pushkin House event on Monday with two other brilliant minds from a different sphere, from cultural sphere, and that would be a philosopher and art theorist Mikhail Yampolsky in conversation with Maria Stepanova, who will provide deep insight into what is happening with Russian-speaking diasporas and what is happening with culture and memory and manipulation of memory. So I promise you it will be as illuminating as tonight, but in a different sphere. But all of them are interconnected. Thank you very much for coming.